Here at BikeRadar, there is two things we often get to do. Number one, we get to ride some very nice bikes. And number two, we often pronounce the names of said bikes completely wrong. With that in mind, I give you possibly one of the lightest disc brake bikes in the world at 5.6 kilograms, this Festka Scalatore. Now often when really nice bikes arrive at BikeRadar towers, they usually come with a proviso that we're not allowed to ride them. They get photographed for the magazine or for a first look, and then they go back to the manufacturer. Well, luckily this time, the nice folk at Festka have said we're actually allowed to ride this one, and that is obviously very exciting. Before we get into what it's like to actually ride a 5.6 kilogram disc brake road bike, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Festka and go through the spec on the build. Festka were founded in 2010 in Prague in the Czech Republic. They originally run out of a small garage. They're much bigger now and they produce around 500 frames a year. A lot of those are custom. Festka say it takes 32 hours to make each frame, and each frame passes through 11 skilled hands before it's finally made. That obviously means they are not cheap, but more about that later. You can get them in all the popular frame materials, so carbon, steel, titanium, but this one, being so light, is obviously made out of good old carbon fibre. We didn't get a chance to actually weigh the frame because the bike came completely assembled, but Festka claim a Scalatore weighs 790 grams. Bar the absolute lightest sub 700 gram frames, that is right up there with the very best. Last interesting point about the frame, whilst most carbon frames these days are made in moulds, Festka is made with a tube-to-tube joining process. This means that while each individual tube is made by a robot, they're joined together by human hands. And if you look closely on the frame, there's some really cool bits on the joints where you can see where each tube has been joined to each joint. Festka claim this means that the frame shouldn't fail you in any circumstances, but if you were to damage it in a really bad crash, you can replace each tube individually. Now we're on to the rest of the build, and I'm going to start with the wheels. They are from a German brand called Schmalker, and they are their TLO, which stands for the lightest 130 tubular wheel set. Being tubs, they're going to be very light. They also come with extra light hubs, which are also very light. So the complete set weighs 990 grams for a road bike disc brake wheel set. Pretty incredible. Next up is the finishing kit, which is nearly all from Schmalker as well. Again, it's part of their TLO range. You've got a saddle that weighs 62 grams. Pretty hard, but much comfier than you think. The post is very much dependent on spec, but this one could be around the 120 gram mark, and the bars, they weigh just 146 grams. The stem is from the same Italian brand as the hub, and that's extra light. That's an aluminium stem. They weigh, again, depending on size, you're talking around 80 grams. Group set is not what I would have expected to find on this bike, and that's Rotor's 1x13 hydraulic group set. The group set is competitively light, so that makes sense. My colleague Jack Luke has also reviewed it on BikeRadar, and he got 3.5 stars out of 5. The hydraulic shifting takes a little bit of time to get used to and isn't as fast as something like Shimano DR2 or SRAM ETAP, but on a bespoke custom build like this, it's kind of cool to see something totally different than what you'd expect. The crankset is another really cool example of lightweight boutique tech that you won't see very often. It's the THM Clavicular SE crankset. It weighs around 300 grams for the crankset. That is incredibly light. Even a kind of lightweight normal crankset, a really light one, you're looking around the 500 gram mark. So the fact that they've knocked off 200 grams off that is amazing. The chain ring is a 1x chain ring, obviously to keep the weight down. It looks to be from Absolute Black. The tyres, again, are tyres you don't see very often. They are the Tufo Elite Ride 23s. Crucially, they are 23mm wide, so that's fairly narrow in this day and age. They're also tubs, so if you did manage to puncture them while you're out and about, you would have to have another tub in your pocket to replace them. Finally, we've got these tuned carbon fibre bottle cages, which probably weigh like 3 grams or something like that. They're incredibly minimal and they look very light. So that's the brief run through of the build. One other thing I'd highly recommend if you're ever lucky enough to own a bike like this or any of these parts is a very accurate torque wrench that goes all the way down to 1 Newton meters. A lot of these boutique carbon parts have incredibly low torque values, things like 1.5 Newton meters. So you really want that accurate torque wrench to ensure you don't end up cracking something when you over-tighten it. So how does it ride? As always, I would have loved to have spent more time on this bike, but here are my brief first impressions. As you'd expect from a custom-made, amazing-looking climbing bike, it is plenty stiff enough for my puny 64 kilogram frame. No matter how hard I pushed on the pedals, it wasn't moving anywhere. The crankset, again, despite its lack of weight, felt plenty stiff enough for me. It also has a fairly narrow Q factor. That's good for people like me that have got really narrow hips. But you'd hopefully expect that from a crankset which costs €1,200. The group set is an interesting alternative. As I've already mentioned, it's not quite as quick as Shimano Di2, but I did like the big hoods when you're out of the saddle, and I kind of like the industrial look of the rear derailleur. Onto those disc brakes. Now, Rotor have teamed up with Magura for their 1x13 group set. Magura are known for making some of the most powerful brakes on the market, and there's no exception here. Tyres are one place I feel the build kind of falls down a little. 23mm tyres are going to be nice and light, but they're also pretty narrow and not the most comfortable. On these kind of horrible roads that we often ride on in Britain, I'd want at least a 25 or a 28mm tyre. Festka claim that you can fit up to 28mm tyres in a Scalatore. And if I was building it myself, I'd definitely want at least a 25 or maybe a 28 in there. It'd add a bit of weight, but you would gain a lot more in terms of comfort. Onto the saddle. Now, usually when you show people a saddle like this, a hard carbon fibre saddle, they immediately say, God, that's got to be the most uncomfortable thing in the world. In actual fact, it's not too bad. I don't think I'd want to do a 6-hour ride on it or anything like that, but I've spent quite a bit of time on this saddle on different bikes, and easily a 3-hour ride. I've got no issues with it. It's got a nice cutout, it's got nice sculpting down the side there, and it's comfortable enough. Remember, it is 62 grams as well. As you already know, the gearing is 1x. That means it's light, but you're always going to have some compromise in terms of your gearing. The Rotor group set is modular, so you can run different cassettes on the back, but no matter what combination you use, you'll never have as many gears as you would with a double. But this is a weight weenie build, so there are going to be some compromises we'll have to accept. From the limited riding I've done, one place it has impressed me where I thought it wouldn't is it's actually quite comfy. With all these super light carbon parts and with the 23mm tyres, I thought I'd be rattled to death on the rough roads, but it's actually fairly smooth. It's not as smooth as something like an endurance bike or something with really big tyres, say a 32mm or a 28, but by no means are you being rattled to death when you're riding this bike. I'd love to be able to take it out for like a 6-hour ride to see how it really holds up when you're really tired. So bar the tyres, which could easily be changed, and the relative delicacy of a true weight weenie build like this, e.g. loads of low torque values and relatively low weight limits, from my limited time on the bike, I can safely say it was an absolute blast. In order to get a full picture of the performance of a bike like this, I need a lot more time riding it, so for now it's just those brief first impressions. The other sticking point about a bike like this, and I'm sure you saw this coming, is the price. Being a full custom model, it's hard to know the true value of a bike like this, but with frame sets starting at £5,190 and considering all the other components on the bike, I expect it to be around the £12,000 to £14,000 mark. That is not a cheap bike. In fact, we reckon you could buy 2 top spec Canyon Ultimates for the same price as one of these. But I think that's kind of defeating the point of a bike like this. Nobody spends £14,000 on a bike and thinks about value. It's not going to be twice as good as the aforementioned Canyon Ultimate. It's more down to emotion and how owning one of these bikes would make you feel. Do you like the fact that the frame set is a totally custom one-off and you've had close contact with the people that actually made it in the first place? Do you like the fact that nearly every component on this bike comes from much smaller brands made in much smaller production runs, so you know you won't be seeing much of it out on your local club run or down at the calf? If that's the case, then bikes like this kind of start to make more sense to the very, very few people who could afford them. Every time you even look at it or take it out for a ride, you should get that warm, fuzzy feeling inside. For the rest of us, it's just a very nice thing to look at, and that's if you're ever even lucky enough to see one out in the wild. So that is the Festka Scalatore. Without a doubt, one of the superest super bikes we've ever had here at BikeRadar. I'd like to know what you guys think. Do we need bikes like this? Do they drive the industry forward? Or is that huge price just too much of a sticking point? As always, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click that little bell icon so every time we upload a video, you get a notification. Goodbye!